Curse of the Eldritch Oak. Lisette stepped off the creaking cart into a world of looming fog and solemn quiet. The remote village, sequestered in a valley of swaying reeds and dark forests, felt like a place long forgotten by time. Her plain skirts, though neat, were damp at the hem from the haze that clung to every surface. The driver offered a slight nod of farewell, eager to leave this forsaken place as quickly as he could. As he flicked the reins, his horse whinnied and the wheels rolled away, carrying with them the only connection Lisette had to the outside world. She took a deep breath, inhaling air thick with the smell of decaying leaves and wet soil. She might have thought the odor peaceful if not for the oppressive silence that pressed against her eardrums. She gathered her few belongings, a satchel of herbs, a small trunk of medical tools, and a pouch of seeds from her grandmother's garden. For years, Lisette had apprenticed under a traveling apothecary, learning the art of healing with plants. She had come here, to this out-of-the-way village, because rumor said they had no resident healer, no one to tend to the sick and dying. Yet beneath this simple need lay another reason that had tugged at her curiosity. Locals from nearby hamlets whispered of an ancient oak in the heart of the forest, a tree whose twisted trunk soared skyward like a phantom's talon. According to the stories, at the stroke of midnight, one could hear it whisper. There were 1,000 superstitions as to what it said. Warnings, curses, pleas for help. No one could agree, but everyone seemed to concur on one fact. The oak was cursed, and those who heard its voice were never the same afterward. The first house Lisette spotted stood apart from the others, its roof half collapsed and wreathed in dead ivy. She entered the village proper, noticing the warped wood of each cottage and the dryness in the grass despite the fog. Despite the stillness, a sense of watchfulness nagged at her. A dog barked from a far corner, but when she turned, she could only see a faded silhouette slipping away between crooked fences. It was near sunset when she found the inn, a sagging structure with a sign so weathered only faint lettering remained. A stooped woman introduced herself as Hetty. Thin-lipped and with silver strands escaping from her cap, Hetty studied Lisette with a mixture of suspicion and relief. Once Lisette explained she was a traveling herbalist come to offer her services, the old woman's suspicion seemed to soften. "Stay as long as you wish, dear," Hetty said. "Beds are warm enough, though can't say the nights are restful." Lisette paid for a room and set down her trunk in a cramped chamber that smelled faintly of mildew. Outside, dusk thickened into a dark, moonless sky, swallowing the village in a hush. Lisette busied herself with reorganizing her seeds and compresses, determined to ignore the creeping chill that seemed to seep under the door. She found comfort in the familiar tasks of measuring out dried chamomile, packaging mint, and ensuring her mortar and pestle were intact. Yet even as she worked, her thoughts kept returning to the ancient oak. She had seen from a distance the black spire of its silhouette as the cart wound through the last bend of the road. It stood beyond the cluster of thatched rooftops in a small clearing ringed by old stones. Or so the tales said. And if rumor was to be believed, something about the tree was not quite natural. That night, sleep was a struggle. The inn's walls were thin. Lisette heard the wind scraping against the shutters like skeletal fingernails. A branch tapped against the window in an unsteady rhythm, as if beckoning her awake. Each time she drifted off, she sensed a strange hush rising from the darkness, a quiet so profound it rang in her ears. It must be the oak, she thought, half in dream. I wonder if it truly whispers. When the clock in the main room downstairs chimed midnight, Lisette bolted upright. She didn't remember falling asleep, but now her heart hammered. The entire inn felt devoid of sound until she heard the faintest of voices. It was an almost imperceptible sigh, more like wind across hollow reeds than speech. Still, Lisette heard something behind it, like a word she couldn't fully make out, an echo of language older than the village itself. She got out of bed and pressed her ear to the window's shuttered slats. There, drifting through the night air, came a hollow susurration. She tensed at the feel of movement beneath the floorboards. Her imagination conjured an image of gnarled roots creeping under the foundation, coiling like serpents. A chill worked its way into her bones. A rational part of her mind insisted it was only the wind, or perhaps the old building settling, but in that moment, logic felt very far away. sleep did not return for hours. Come morning, Lisette woke bleary-eyed and descended to the small common area for breakfast. She found the stooped innkeeper stoking a feeble fire and a single patron sitting at a corner table, a wiry man with a heavy cloak. Introductions were terse but polite. He called himself Oswald, a local woodcutter. His face bore a constant tension, as if he were forever poised to flee some unseen terror. "I'm told you know your way around an herb or two," Oswald said after a sip of weak tea. "My wife's had a fever these last 3 nights. No remedy seems to help." Lisette was glad for a chance to prove her worth. She nodded, gathering her satchel and following him out. They walked past the battered cottages and into a row of modest huts, where the tang of damp straw filled the lanes. He led her inside his humble home. It was a single-room structure with a small table, a straw bed, and a hearth that gave off little warmth. On the bed lay a pale woman, eyes closed, sweat beading on her brow. "I've tried everything," Oswald whispered. "Elderberry honey? Nothing." Lisette placed a gentle hand on the woman's forehead. The fever burned hot, yet her breath was steady, as though she hung in a dream. Lisette examined her pulse, then rummaged through her satchel, taking out a small jar of powdered willow bark and an infusion of wild thyme. She heated water over the fire, mixing in the herbs. "This should bring her fever down," Lisette said, tilting the cup to the woman's lips. "We'll see if she wakes soon." Oswald watched anxiously. He cleared his throat, as though summoning courage. I fear it's the tree," he said in a trembling voice. "She went near that blasted oak last week, gathering wild berries. Came back looking like she'd seen a spectre. Been feverish ever since." "The oak," Lisette repeated, eyebrows knitting. "How would a tree cause this?" He only shrugged, expression miserable. "Cursed, some say. It's older than the village itself. They say it survived countless storms and a great fire centuries ago, when half the region burned. But each tragedy it survived, the tree grew more warped, more hungry." Lisette suppressed a shiver. "Hungry? Sometimes at night," Oswald said in a hush, "you can see the roots shift beneath the earth. They worm their way out, snare unsuspecting folk. And if you're unlucky, you hear a voice whispering your name." A rational part of Lisette wanted to scoff, but she remembered the midnight hush, the faint whisper. Even if it was but legend, the fear in Oswald's voice was real. She found herself questioning everything she thought she understood about nature. After all, her knowledge told her that trees were simply living plants, not malevolent forces. Yet the stories were too numerous to ignore. She stayed by Oswald's wife's side until late afternoon. Under Lisette's care, the woman's fever broke, and she drifted into a more natural sleep. Relieved, Lisette departed with a promise to return. On the way back, her gaze fell upon the cluster of oak branches rising on the horizon. Something about that silhouette was hypnotic, like a riddle carved in midnight. She couldn't resist her curiosity. As soon as she dropped off her supplies at the inn, she headed into the forest. The air grew colder with each step. The canopy was so thick that only slivers of sunlight made it through, painting the undergrowth with shifting patterns of gold and shadow. From time to time, she caught glimpses of twisted roots pushing out of the ground, coiling around rocks and reaching across the path like beckoning fingers. A hush overtook the forest. No birds sang, even the rustle of critters was absent, as though the entire woodland were poised in reverent fear. At last, she arrived at a clearing ringed by ancient stones, each worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. And at the center, rearing up like a spectre, stood the Eldritch Oak. Its trunk was gargantuan, so wide it would take a dozen people to encircle it with linked arms. The bark was blackish-brown, with knots and hollows that resembled gaunt faces. High above, gnarled branches twisted and tangled in a canopy that seemed to blot out the sky. A low breeze stirred the leaves, producing a soft sibilance that sounded maddeningly close to whispers. Standing there, Lisette felt inexplicably small. She was used to the presence of old trees. She had grown up in forests. But this was different. The Eldritch Oak radiated an aura of awareness, as if it looked back at her from countless knotholes. Cautiously, she approached the wide trunk. Curiosity warred with an instinctive dread. She circled around the tree, noting how its roots coiled in chaotic loops that seemed half buried in the soil. She saw an opening in the trunk, a hollow large enough for a grown person to climb through if they so desired. From that black hole wafted the faint scent of decay, a damp, earthy rot that churned her stomach. As she drew closer, a gust of wind rattled the branches, and she jumped back, heart pounding. The hollow almost seemed to breathe. Lisette forced herself to step away. Perhaps it was enough to have seen the tree by daylight. She could study it more carefully and come back better prepared, if she dared. On the walk back, she felt as if roots and vines shifted behind her, scraping the earth, but each time she turned, she found only stillness. That night at the inn, the villagers gathered around the fireplace for supper. Lisette overheard anxious conversations about missing travelers and livestock found strangled by creeping roots. She listened quietly, gleaning tidbits of lore. One man insisted he'd heard the tree call him by name at midnight, and he claimed he only escaped its lure by reciting prayers. Another woman swore her late husband had vanished into the hollow trunk, leaving behind only a single muddy boot. Hetty, the innkeeper, cast nervous glances at Lisette. "Forgive their prattle," she said, leaning close. "We've had no real trouble from the oak in over a decade. It's just rumors that keep us all on edge." "But what of the travelers who went missing?" Lisette pressed gently. "And the twisted roots?" Hetty's expression faltered. "They say the oak's thirst grows in cycles. Many years can pass in peace, and then someone hears it whisper. After that, more vanish." She shuddered, pulling her shawl closer. "It's never been this active, though. Not in my lifetime." Lisette's mind raced. Could the tree itself be drawing upon some corrupt energy? Or was it an old curse laid upon these woods that twisted the oak into a malevolent presence? She retreated to her room, determined to focus on reason. She was a trained herbalist, skilled in identifying ailments of body and mind. If the tree's influence was real, then perhaps there was a remedy, a means to cleanse this place of whatever foulness possessed it. In the days that followed, Lisette made notes of local plants, searching for anything rumored to ward off malevolent forces. She knew from her grandmother's teachings that certain herbs, like yarrow and blackthorn, were believed to break hexes. She also recalled old folk recipes involving the bark of rowan trees and the flowers of elder, both said to repel evil spirits. Gathering such ingredients proved a challenge in the dense, foreboding forest. More than once, she sensed movement among the towering pines, as though eyes peered at her from behind the undergrowth. One evening, she ventured out just before dusk. She carried a small basket and a lantern, heading toward the creek in search of watercress and other aquatic plants. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the shadows lengthened, and the path grew strangely tangled, as if the roots had shifted to lead her astray. Twice, she tripped on protruding roots, scraping her palms raw. When she finally reached the creek, she found it nearly choked with algae and slime. She knelt on the bank, dipping her lantern lower. The reflection of the orange flame danced on the water. Suddenly, she felt a tug on her ankle. She yelped, nearly toppling face first into the creek. Whirling around, she saw a root-like tendril slithering from the muddy bank, coiling around her boot. With trembling hands, she kicked at it, heart hammering. The tendril released her with a wet squelch, retracting into the mud as though alive. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping her lantern, her pulse roaring in her ears. This was no mere superstition. The stories were true. The Eldritch Oak's roots seemed capable of stretching through the soil for some unholy distance. Lisette wasted no time. She gathered her wits and fled. In her frantic run back to the inn, branches snatched at her cloak, the underbrush scraping her shins. She burst into the common room, panting. Several villagers looked up at her in alarm, but she only shook her head, stumbling upstairs to her room without a word. That night, she hardly slept. Each time her eyes drifted shut, she imagined the floorboards splitting open, skeletal roots slithering around her ankles, dragging her into the darkness beneath the inn. In that half-awake delirium, she heard whispers, louder this time, crooning in a voice that was almost human. "Come, child, enter the hollow, find what you seek." When morning came, Lisette resolved to act. She began brewing test concoctions with the anti-hex herbs she had gathered, meticulously recording her observations. She visited Oswald's wife, who was now recovered, to see if there were any lingering effects. Oswald said she still had nightmares, always featuring blackened branches and a rumbling voice. Meanwhile, Lisette learned that 2 travelers who had been passing through the village had vanished without a trace the previous night. They had intended to stay at the inn, but never arrived. Whispers spread that the oak had claimed them. Driven by a mounting determination, Lisette took a portion of her herbal mixture, heavy on rowan bark, elderflower, and a pinch of salt for purification, and set off toward the clearing. She knew this was dangerous, but each day she waited, the oak's power seemed to grow. She convinced herself that if she acted quickly, she might break the curse before more people disappeared. The forest was unnaturally silent. The only sound was her footfall crackling over dead leaves. The sun was high, illuminating the clearing in a stark, pallid light. The Eldritch Oak loomed before her, its massive trunk casting a long shadow. She approached carrying a small earthen bowl of her potion. Her plan was rudimentary: spread the mixture around the base of the tree in hopes that it would repel the oak's foul energy. But as she neared the trunk, a deep vibration coursed through the ground. Roots coiled, and the hollow yawned open like a hungry mouth. Something about that void compelled her forward, a gravitational pull that felt more like an enchantment than curiosity. She resisted, shaking her head to clear her thoughts, but the voice came again, low and hypnotic. It seemed to promise secret knowledge, unveiling truths hidden behind centuries of bark and leaf. Her heart hammered, and for a moment she found her feet inching toward the hollow against her will. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the edges of the clearing. She needed to concentrate on the potion. Kneeling at the base, she poured the thick mixture around the roots. The air grew heavier, as if a storm were brewing in that small glade. The oak's limbs shuddered, releasing a sound that was half groan, half raw. A gust of wind nearly knocked Lisette backward, scattering the bowl from her hands. She scrambled away as the ground erupted in writhing roots, snapping and coiling in blind fury. One root lashed across her arm, leaving a gash. She bit back a scream, her entire body trembling. The uproar lasted only a moment, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. Her potion was affecting the tree, and it was enraged. Panting and shaken, she saw that her bowl had been flung aside. Only a small portion of the brew had spilled on the roots. Judging by the oak's wrath, that bit had caused it great pain. Yet it was not enough to break the curse outright. Retreating, Lisette clutched her wounded arm. She knew she would need a stronger concoction and perhaps more direct contact with the oak's heart. She fled the clearing, the oak's whispers echoing behind her like a dire threat reverberating through the still air. She spent the next few days in feverish preparation. Word spread among the villagers of her attempt and the oak's violent response. Some urged her to leave, to save herself before the tree's wrath claimed them all. Others, desperate for hope, volunteered whatever folklore and suggestions they could remember. Hetty recalled an old verse that her grandmother had sung about banishing forest demons. Rowan bark and thorn of white cast out darkness, seal with light. Lisette latched onto those words, deducing that the oak needed a full, powerful ritual. Night after night, she pored over every scrap of knowledge she possessed, combining it with the villagers' superstitions. She discovered an old text referencing the use of silver in banishing rites. Silver, like salt, was believed to purify. She obtained a small silver pendant from Hetty, a family heirloom, and melted it down in a makeshift crucible, infusing her brew with the molten droplets, carefully cooled. By the end of it, she had a potent cleansing mixture that shimmered with an otherworldly sheen. While she worked, the village's nightmares grew worse. Several more people disappeared, their homes found empty and their beds unslept in. Some swore they heard screams from the forest. Others claimed to see pale faces pressed against the hollow trunk at dusk, as though the souls of the missing were trapped within the oak's core. Fear warped the village's atmosphere until each sunset felt like a prelude to doom. But Lisette pressed on, guided by a fierce compassion. She refused to let that cursed tree devour more innocent lives. When all her ingredients were combined, the brew emitted a faint glow, and the scent was strangely sweet, tinged with lavender and thyme. but beneath that floral hint lay a strong, almost metallic tang. The silver, perhaps, or the concentrated power of centuries-old knowledge. On the final night, Lisette approached the Eldritch Oak for what she hoped was the last time. Moonlight bathed the clearing in an eerie glow, and the ancient stones surrounding the tree seemed to pulse with a silent energy, as if they had witnessed countless rituals and tragedies across the ages. Clutching a flask of her finished potion, she advanced on the oak. The wind roared through its branches, and a cacophony of whispers filled the air, an incomprehensible babble that both beckoned and cursed her in the same breath. She noticed movement among the roots, twisted shapes, some resembling human limbs, protruded from the soil as though half subsumed in the bark. A low moaning came from within the trunk, as though tortured spirits wept from some dark domain. Shuddering, Lisette raised the flask. The tree reacted at once, launching serpentine roots at her, whipping through the air. She pivoted, narrowly avoiding a lashing tendril. Another root snared her skirt, tearing the fabric. With trembling resolve, she wrenched free and plunged forward. She didn't wait. She poured the shimmering potion directly onto the largest root cluster at the base of the trunk. A deafening shriek ripped through the night. The oak convulsed, bark splitting and sap leaking like thick, dark blood. The ground shook, and the ancient stones around the clearing cracked. For a terrifying moment, Lisette feared the entire forest would collapse upon itself. But she held fast, continuing to pour every last drop of her brew, chanting the verse Hetty had taught her. Rowan bark and thorn of white, cast out darkness, seal with light. Her voice rose above the shrieking wind. The silver-laced mixture bubbled and steamed against the gnarled bark, creating deep fissures in the trunk. A furious howl of wind tore at her hair. The oak's branches flailed, snapping off in a nightmarish thrashing dance, as though the tree itself were fighting death. Clutching the empty flask, Lisette staggered backward, bracing herself for the final onslaught. Then, just as suddenly, the wind died. An unearthly stillness enveloped the clearing. The oak stood motionless, its bark riven by deep cracks. Pale mist seeped from these openings, carrying with it a chorus of soft gasps. For one haunting moment, Lisette saw translucent shapes drifting free from the trunk. Faces of men, women, and children, their expressions of agony melting into relief. They floated upward, dissolving like morning dew in sunlight. Where once the oak's bark was black and corrupted, it now lightened to a subdued grey. The hollow trunk quivered, then collapsed inward. Whisper-like groans faded into the hush of the forest. Slowly, the monstrous roots curled back into the ground, leaving a wide patch of uprooted earth in their wake. Lisette blinked in disbelief, tears burning her eyes. She felt an overwhelming sense of release, as if centuries of pain and darkness had been lifted from the land. The clearing smelled of fresh soil and cut grass, no longer tainted by decay. At her feet lay the battered remains of the oak's trunk, still massive but no longer menacing. The swirling presence of trapped souls had vanished, set free by her cleansing ritual. Dawn broke by the time Lisette trudged back to the village, exhausted and bloodied. Her dress was torn, her face smeared with dirt. But in her eyes shone a triumphant light. Villagers ventured out of their homes, having sensed a shift in the night's foul energy. Hetty rushed forward, gasping at the sight of Lisette's injuries. "It's done," Lisette said, her voice trembling with relief. "The oak, its curse is broken." A hush fell over the gathered townsfolk, followed by murmurs of disbelief and cautious hope. Oswald reached out, placing a hand on Lisette's shoulder. "You're certain?" She offered him a small, weary smile. "I saw the spirits flee. The whispers have ceased." They guided her to the inn, where clean water and bandages awaited. One by one, villagers gathered, their eyes bright with gratitude. Oswald's wife pressed a bowl of hot broth into Lisette's hands. Others brought blankets, herbs for her wounds. Ironic that she, the herbalist, now needed the healing arts. Outside, a spontaneous cheer broke out, subdued yet genuine. People embraced one another, tears mingling with smiles. The fear that had gripped their hearts for so long was finally loosening its hold. Over the next days, Lisette recuperated, her arm healing under careful poultices. Several curious souls ventured out to the clearing to see the oak's remains. They reported that its trunk was split wide open, no longer forbidding or dangerous. The roots that had once lashed out at travelers now looked withered, their bark pale and harmless. And when midnight came, no one heard the faintest whisper. At the inn, a celebration was held. Simple but heartfelt, it featured fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and a modest serving of ale. The villagers toasted Lisette, calling her their savior. She felt a bit embarrassed by the attention, but a warmth bloomed in her heart, knowing she had truly helped them. "Thank you," an elderly man said, tears brimming in his eyes. "My grandson vanished into that tree last winter. At least now I know his spirit is free." Lisette clasped his hands, emotions surging through her. "He rests in peace," she said softly. Eventually, as the day wore on, she found a quiet moment to slip outside. The sky was alight with the orange glow of dusk. Though the reek of fear had dissipated, the village remained humble, overshadowed by the dense forest. Lisette looked toward the distant clearing. The silhouette of the oak was hardly recognizable now, just a broken shape against the horizon. She inhaled, sensing the forest's breath, no longer hostile but calm and watchful. Her role here was complete, she realized. The village was safe. The curse that had festered for centuries was cleansed. Wounds would heal, nightmares would fade. The missing travelers, while gone from this world, were freed from the oak's twisted prison. And in time, the villagers might even forget the terror that once stalked them in the dead of night. She turned to see Hetty standing at the threshold, a fond look on her face. "You've done us a world of good, child," the innkeeper said. "We'll never forget it." Lisette smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I only did what any healer would do." "Some might have fled at the first whisper," Hetty pointed out gently, "but you stayed." Lisette gazed at the horizon one more time. "I hope the land will heal now," she said. "Perhaps the forest will reclaim what's left of the oak, and new life will grow in its place." With a resolute nod, she walked back inside to join the celebration. Tomorrow, she would begin the next chapter of her journey, perhaps traveling to another remote corner of the land to lend her healing skills. But for this night, she allowed herself to partake in the villagers' gratitude and the serene knowledge that the curse had been broken. The Eldritch Oak's malignant whispers would never again disturb the midnight air. And so the village found peace under the healing hush of a curse lifted. The twisted roots no longer snared unwary feet, and the hollow trunk no longer beckoned travelers with false promises. After decades of fear and loss, the little hamlet could finally sleep without dread, lulled by the gentle rustle of leaves, no longer a malevolent whisper, but a comforting lullaby carried on the breeze.